big story, and the former top cop and special advisor to number 10 Downing Street, Rory Geoghegan, has written an explosive piece this week in The Telegraph, arguing that a focus on social justice and woke political correct causes is making the streets less safe and making issues like racism even worse. In his article, which is a cracking read, he argues the police top brass have dragged policing into the middle of an ideological and political battleground with support for the controversial Black Lives Matter organisation and a perceived soft touch towards eco-campaigners. He's also expressed concerns that the fear of being labelled racist led to the grooming gangs scandals, among other crimes. He cites the College of Policing's updated Code of Ethics, which he says reads more like a social justice warrior's charter than a serious document to support men and women to bravely fight crime. So is British policing now institutionally woke, and as a consequence, are the streets less safe? Let's welcome Rory Geoghegan, who is now the director of the Public Safety Foundation. Rory, great to have you on the show. What is the real-world impact of this culture of political correctness within policing?
Well, look, Mark, you've given me a great introduction. I suppose I'd just say, firstly, the top cops at the moment are the men and women out on the front lines, still fighting crime, using stop and search, despite the fact that every voice around them seems to be against them. So, look, I mean, I think policing is captured. I think a lot of the public think policing is captured, but that capture is actually over a pretty small part of policing. You know, you could probably fit most of the kind of people who are part of the problem here into kind of, you know, a secondary school kind of hall. So the vast majority of men and women out there doing the job, they're as fed up of this as we are, as the public are. And the most recent polling showed 40% of the public think the police are now more interested in being woke than in fighting crime. Well, you know, that I'm sure would be resonated with the front line. I'm sure the front line themselves would feel, if not more so than that. So for me, yeah, there is capture, and those divisive ideologies that we see elsewhere. And, you know, the previous segment spoke about the kind of gender ideology stuff. Well, you know, gender ideology, critical race theory, the anti-racist ideology, that is within the sort of the DNA, if you will, of certain echelons within policing, and it needs to be gripped.
Well, indeed, critical race theory is very contested because it goes against Martin Luther King's push for a colourblind society. He famously said we should be judged on our character, not the colour of our skin. Critical race theory focuses on segregation, black-only audiences at theatre shows, safe spaces for people of colour at university, which you could argue is racist. So how have police forces been captured by these ideas? What's behind this, Rory?
I think the most recent sort of probably moment where some of this kind of ideology crept in and was arguably invited in, perhaps in some cases, was obviously in the wake of the George Floyd death over in America. So thousands of miles away, completely different continent, you know, and obviously for some bizarre reason, a sort of an over-ambition around bringing some of that critical race theory and the ideology associated with it into UK policing. It probably hasn't helped. It definitely hasn't helped that I think politicians in Parliament, and we see this on other issues too, often quite at odds with where the public are at on issues. And so I think it's very easy for a lot of parliamentarians to kind of just nod and go along with a lot of this stuff when actually their constituents would be sort of appalled and are appalled by it. So the sort of the post-George Floyd moment was a real one. And obviously we saw a small number of police officers taking the knee, but we saw chief constables, some of them, you know, failing to kind of recognise that that was a political statement and that it completely undermined the whole point of being, you know, an impartial police officer. So I think, you know, that was probably the most recent moment. But of course, perhaps the next major moment will be the next general election. You know, kind of, you know, we're basically going to be looking at probably a Labour Party with a big manifesto with a focus on racial justice. Well, you know, that should send shivers through anyone who already thinks things have gone too far. And so I think we've got to be very careful about where this goes next. And I really worry that, you know, policing and police chiefs, and the reason I'm speaking out on this is that I don't think police chiefs have either paid enough attention to this or paid enough sort of critical kind of attention to it. And certainly they don't seem to have much inclination towards addressing what 40% of the public feel, which is that the police are woke. You know, if that many people felt the police was something else, you'd hope the police might listen, but for some reason there's a real blind spot here. And another critical moment, I think, for both the public and the police will be when the Chief Inspector of Constabulary reports on their review into political activism, which obviously Suella Braverman quite rightly sort of called on the inspectorate to review. And my fear is that the cops will wimp out. My fear is that they will think, actually, Labour government probably on the way, we can probably get away with this and we can probably just keep the show on the road. When in fact, there should be a big, red light here. There should be a big stop sign in the road. Enough is enough. Policing shouldn't be having anything to do with the sort of the mad gender ideology, the mad critical race theory, or the mad sort of associated anti-racist ideology.
I share your concerns about a Labour government and the police getting even more woke. Of course, Labour would argue that crime has risen and they will do a much better job than the Tories, who have made a Horlicks of public safety over the last 14 years. Rory, you've been a top cop. You've also been an advisor to Number 10. What is the solution here? How do we fix this?
It's a good question. I mean, if we don't start to fix it, and I'll come on to how we do that, but if we don't start to fix it, then I think what we'll inevitably see down the road, off the back of probably a political earthquake in terms of parliamentary sort of sense, right, of either a new party or a kind of landslide majority in favour of someone new bringing common sense. If policing doesn't sort of get ahead of that, it will find itself potentially pretty washed away with that. In terms of how we could get a grip of it now, so obviously the Chief Inspector of Constabulary could do the right thing here and recognise that these ideologies are divisive, they're problematic, and therefore things like the Race Action Plan need to be sort of paused and revisited. But there's also a role here for the police and crime commissioners and local mayors. Obviously we might not expect much from some of them who are completely on the sort of the train towards this kind of social justice land. But for those police and crime commissioners and for those mayors out there, or aspiring mayors and PCCs, there is an opportunity in the forthcoming local elections in May for them to stand on a platform of common sense. And we've seen some of that in the US, and I'm hopeful that we might start to see some of that here in some of the local elections, such as the police and crime commissioner elections, because that would, I think, a local police and crime commissioner with a clear local democratic mandate to say, do you know what, our cops are not going to be playing politics with some of this stuff, our chiefs aren't going to be getting into the activist space. I think that would actually galvanise some new chiefs. And ultimately, the police and crime commissioner, they have the ability to hire a new chief. And of course, one of those interview questions could well be, what will you do to deal with the political activism that's rife?
Rory, a real treat to have you on the show. My thanks to Rory Geoghegan, who is the director of the